If you asked me what hurts the most about growing old, I wouldn't tell you it was the aching knees that complained every time winter returned. I wouldn't tell you it was waking up in the middle of the night because the house had become too quiet. I would tell you this. The hardest part of growing old is watching the child you once carried in your arms slowly become a visitor in your life. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 70 years old. I've been a widow for more than 40 years. And for most of my life, I believed that if I loved my son enough, he would always find his way home. Every Thanksgiving morning begins the same way. Long before the sun rises, I tie on my faded blue apron and stand in the little kitchen that has been mine for nearly 5 decades. The window above the sink looks out toward the maple tree my husband planted the year Daniel was born. Its branches are older now, so am I. I peel the apples carefully, one by one, sprinkle cinnamon over them. Fold butter into the dough, exactly the way my mother taught me. People say recipes are written on paper. I don't believe that. The best recipes are written into your hands after making them hundreds of times for someone you love. As the pie bakes, the smell fills every corner of the house. Warm apples, brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, it smells like childhood. It smells like home. It smells like the years when a little boy would run through the front door shouting, "Mom." I can smell the pie from outside. I still hear that voice sometimes, especially when the house is quiet. I set the dining table for 3, 1 plate for me, 1 for Daniel, 1 for Evelyn. People often ask why I still do that. After all, my son hasn't spent Thanksgiving here in 3 years. But a mother never prepares for absence, she prepares for hope. The empty chair across from mine has become part of the room. Every Saturday evening I dust it, every Sunday I straighten it. Every holiday I place a folded napkin beside it. Not because someone tells me to. Because love is often nothing more than repeating the same act of faith until your heart learns to live with disappointment. Around 11 o'clock my phone rings. I already know who it is. I answer before the second ring. "Hi, Mom." Daniel's voice is warm, gentle. Exactly the way it has always been. For a brief moment, I close my eyes and imagine he's still the little boy who used to hold my hand while crossing the street. "Happy Thanksgiving, sweetheart." He hesitates. "I'm so sorry. Evelyn's family decided to host lunch earlier this year. We won't be able to make it." There is silence between us, not uncomfortable silence. Just the kind that grows between people who love each other, but no longer share enough moments together. "It's all right," I tell him softly. "You take care of your family. I'll come next weekend. You don't have to rush. I miss you, Mom. I know, and I do know." Daniel has never stopped loving me. Life simply became louder than memory. Work, meetings, clients, responsibilities. Little by little, those things filled the spaces where family dinners once lived. We say goodbye. The call lasts less than 2 minutes. Yet after I set my phone down, the house somehow feels even quieter than before. The pie comes out of the oven perfectly golden. The crust is flaky, the apples soft. Exactly the way Daniel loved them. I leave it on the table for almost an hour. Old habits are stubborn companions. Then I cut it into small slices and wrap each piece carefully. Across the street, the Henderson children are already playing football in the yard. Their laughter echoes through the cold afternoon air. When they see me carrying the pie, they run over. "Grandma Margaret," I smile. There was too much pie for one person. That isn't entirely true. There wasn't too much pie. There was simply too much loneliness. On my way back home, Mrs. Henderson catches up with me. She has lived next door for 27 years. Long enough to know the difference between a woman who is happy and a woman pretending to be. "Did Daniel cancel again?" I nod. She squeezes my hand. "You should tell him how much it hurts." I look toward my little white house. Smoke still rises gently from the chimney. The maple leaves cover the front yard like a blanket of red and gold. Then I smile the way mothers always do when protecting their children, even from guilt. "No. Children already carry enough weight in this world. They don't need to carry their mother's sadness too. Mrs. Henderson says nothing, neither do I. Some kinds of love become too deep for words. That evening I wash 3 plates instead of 1, I fold the extra napkins, push in the empty chair, turn off the kitchen light. Before going upstairs, I stop for one last look at the dining room. The pie is gone. The dishes are clean. Everything is exactly where it should be, everything. Except the family that once made this little house feel alive. Standing there in the fading light, I whisper the same sentence I have whispered every Thanksgiving for years. Maybe next year, and somehow. I still believe it. People often say that time heals everything. I don't believe that. Time doesn't heal. It simply teaches us how to carry pain without letting the world notice. 42 years ago, I stood beside a wooden coffin wearing a black dress that didn't quite fit. I was 29 years old. Too young to be called a widow. Too frightened to imagine raising a child alone. Daniel was only 4. He didn't understand why everyone was crying. He tugged gently at my sleeve and whispered, "When is Daddy coming home?" I looked down at the little boy holding my hand. His eyes were so innocent, so full of hope. I knelt beside him and brushed the hair away from his forehead. "Daddy's going to watch over us from heaven now." He frowned, "But who will fix my bicycle?" I smiled, "I will." "And who will carry me when I get tired?" "I will." "And who will protect us?" I wrapped my arms around him, "I will." At that moment, standing beneath a gray November sky, I made a promise. Not to my husband, not to God. But to the little boy, whose entire world now rested in my trembling hands. No matter how difficult life became, I would never allow him to feel fatherless. The weeks after the funeral passed like a blur. Bills arrived faster than sympathy, flowers withered, visitors stopped coming. The silence settled into the house until it became another piece of furniture. Every morning before sunrise, I cleaned offices downtown. By 8 o'clock, I rushed to a grocery store where I stocked shelves until afternoon. At night, after Daniel fell asleep, I folded laundry at a neighborhood dry cleaner until nearly midnight. Some days I worked 3 jobs. Some weeks I barely remembered what it felt like to sit down. But every evening before I opened our front door, I stopped for just a moment. I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair, forced a smile onto my face. Because I never wanted my son to think poverty lived inside our home. Children should know love before they know struggle. Winter was always the hardest. The old furnace broke almost every year. I learned how to repair it myself with borrowed tools and handwritten instructions from the library. The roof leaked whenever heavy snow melted. I climbed onto it alone. The gutters clogged. I cleaned them. The grass grew too tall. I pushed the mower until my hands blistered. There were no heroes coming to rescue us, so I became one, not because I was brave, but because mothers rarely have the luxury of being afraid. Money was always short. I kept every receipt in a small notebook. Every dollar had a purpose. School supplies, medicine, winter boots, lunch money. When Daniel needed new shoes, I stitched another patch onto my own. When he wanted to join the school science club, I canceled the doctor's appointment I'd been postponing for months. When he dreamed of attending summer camp, I sold my wedding ring. I told him I'd misplaced it while gardening. He believed me. Children trust their mothers. They never imagine the quiet bargains being made behind closed doors. Sometimes, after Daniel fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of unpaid bills. The numbers rarely worked. I would erase them, write them again, erase them once more. Then I would look toward his bedroom door and whisper, "We'll figure it out." And somehow, we always did. Every birthday, I baked him an apple pie. Not because it was inexpensive. In truth, apples cost more than I should have spent. But his smile when he smelled cinnamon, filling the house, made every sacrifice worthwhile. He would blow out the candles with both eyes squeezed shut. Then hug me so tightly I could hardly breathe. "I'll take care of you when I grow up, Mom." I laughed every time, not because I doubted him, but because mothers don't raise children expecting repayment. We raise them hoping they will one day build lives so full of happiness that they never have to make the sacrifices we did. Years passed. Daniel grew taller. His shoes became larger than mine. His voice grew deeper. His dreams reached farther than our little town. Teachers praised his intelligence. Neighbors admired his kindness. Whenever someone complimented him, they would turn to me and say, "You must be proud." I always answered the same way. I've been proud since the day he learned to say Mom. On the day he graduated from high school as valedictorian, the entire auditorium stood and applauded. I stood in the back row wearing a dress I'd altered 3 different times because I couldn't afford a new one. When Daniel looked into the crowd searching for me, our eyes met. He smiled. Not the confident smile of a brilliant student, but the same smile he wore when he was 4 years old and believed his mother could fix anything. In that moment, every blister, every sleepless night, every lonely dinner, every silent tear became worth it. Because the little boy who once asked who would protect him had become a young man ready to chase a future bigger than anything I had ever imagined. As the ceremony ended, he wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "This is only the beginning, Mom. One day I'll give you the life you deserve." I kissed his forehead, held him a little tighter, and silently prayed that no matter how far life carried him, he would never forget the little white house where every dream he ever had first learned how to walk. There is a strange kind of happiness that only mothers understand. It is the joy of watching your child outgrow the life you worked so hard to build for them, and the quiet sorrow of realizing that one day they will have to leave it behind. After graduating from high school, Daniel received a scholarship to one of the best law schools in the state. The acceptance letter arrived on a rainy afternoon. I was hanging laundry behind the house when the mailman waved an envelope in the air. "Looks important, Margaret." My hands trembled before I even opened it. Daniel stood beside me, pretending to stay calm, but I could see the nervous tapping of his fingers against his leg. When I unfolded the letter and read the first line, neither of us spoke. We simply looked at each other. Then he pulled me into the tightest embrace I had felt since he was a little boy. "We did it, Mom. Not I did it, we did it." Those 3 words became one of the greatest rewards of my life. For weeks, the whole neighborhood celebrated. Mrs. Henderson baked cookies. Mr. Lewis from the hardware store insisted on giving Daniel a new suitcase. The librarian slipped an old fountain pen into his hand and said, "A lawyer should always carry something that remembers every word." Our little town had watched him grow up. His success belonged to everyone. The night before he left for college, we sat on the front porch together. The summer air smelled of freshly cut grass. Fireflies floated across the yard. Daniel rested his head against the wooden railing and looked toward the stars. "Mom, are you scared?" I smiled. "About what?" "That I'll leave." I thought for a moment, then answered honestly. "I've spent 18 years teaching you how to fly. It would make no sense to be afraid when you finally spread your wings." He reached for my hand. "I'll come home every weekend." I laughed softly. "Don't make promises to comfort your mother. Make promises to yourself. Live well, work hard, be kind. The rest will take care of itself." He nodded. But before going inside, he turned back. I'll never forget where I came from. At the time, I believed him completely. Law school changed Daniel's life. He studied harder than anyone I had ever known. He worked part-time at a legal aid office, spent nights in the library, graduated with honors. Soon after, one of the largest law firms in the city offered him a position. The salary was more money than I had earned in several years combined. When he called to tell me, his voice shook with excitement. "I bought you a new refrigerator, Mom." I looked at the old white refrigerator humming in my kitchen. Its handle was loose, the paint had faded. But it had survived every difficult year with us. "You should save your money." "No. You've done enough saving for both of us." A week later, the new refrigerator arrived. Daniel had also replaced the washing machine, the old heater, even the roof. Neighbors whispered that Margaret Collins had the best son in the county. I believed that too. Because success had not changed his heart, at least not yet. 2 years later, Daniel invited me to a charity gala, hosted by his law firm. I had never attended an event like that before. The ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers. Women wore elegant gowns. Men in tailored tuxedos greeted one another with practiced confidence. I felt out of place the moment I stepped inside, then Daniel walked toward me. His smile erased every insecurity. He kissed my cheek and proudly introduced me to everyone. This is my mother. Everything I am today exists because of her. I wanted to disappear from embarrassment. But inside, my heart overflowed. For one beautiful evening, I did not feel like a widow from a small town. I felt like the richest woman in the room. That was the night I first met Evelyn Harper. She stood across the ballroom wearing a deep emerald dress that matched her eyes, graceful, confident. Beautiful in a way that drew every conversation toward her. She came from one of the oldest and wealthiest families in the city. Her father owned investment companies. Her mother chaired several charitable foundations. She carried herself with effortless elegance. Yet when Daniel introduced us, Evelyn smiled warmly. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you, Mrs. Collins. Daniel talks about you all the time." Her handshake was gentle, her manners impeccable. As the evening continued, I watched the way she listened when Daniel spoke. The way he looked at her when she laughed. The way their eyes met across crowded rooms. A mother knows when her child has fallen in love, even before he says a word. Driving home that night, Daniel seemed unusually quiet. Finally, he admitted, "I think she's different." I looked out the passenger window at the city lights slipping past. Then don't ask yourself whether she's perfect. Ask yourself whether she makes you want to become a better man. Months later, he called with trembling excitement. "Mom, I'm going to ask Evelyn to marry me." I closed my eyes, my little boy. The child who once clung to my coat on the first day of kindergarten was about to begin a family of his own. On the day of the wedding, the church overflowed with flowers and music. Guests traveled from across the country. The reception hall sparkled beneath thousands of tiny lights. As Daniel stood at the altar waiting for Evelyn, I noticed something familiar. The same nervous smile, the same restless hands, the same hopeful eyes. For just a moment, I no longer saw a successful attorney. I saw the little boy who used to run home with scraped knees, believing his mother could fix anything. When the ceremony ended, Daniel walked over before greeting anyone else. He hugged me tightly. "Thank you for bringing me this far." I touched his face and whispered, "No, sweetheart, from here, you build the rest." As I watched him walk away hand in hand with his bride, pride filled every corner of my heart. I truly believed my years of sacrifice had reached their happiest ending. I did not know that love can remain unchanged. While distance quietly begins to grow, not through anger, not through betrayal, but through postponed visits, missed Sundays, and the dangerous illusion that there will always be another tomorrow to go home. People often imagine that families fall apart because of one terrible moment, one argument, one betrayal, one unforgivable mistake. But that isn't how it happened to us. Families rarely break all at once, they drift apart quietly. One postponed visit, one unanswered invitation, one missed Sunday at a time. The first year after Daniel married Evelyn was beautiful. They bought a small townhouse in the city. Every Sunday afternoon, they drove out to see me. Evelyn always brought fresh flowers. Daniel insisted on mowing my lawn before we ate. After dinner, the three of us would sit on the porch drinking coffee, while the evening breeze carried the scent of roses through the yard. Sometimes Evelyn would ask for my apple pie recipe. Sometimes Daniel would tease her because she always added too much cinnamon. Those were happy days, simple days. The kind you never realize are precious until they quietly disappear. Then Daniel was promoted. his responsibilities doubled. The phone rang more often, business trips became longer. Court cases stretched late into the evenings. The Sunday visits slowly changed. Instead of every week, they became every other week, then once a month, then only on holidays. Each time Daniel called, his voice carried genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Mom, this case is important. I understand," and I truly did. I had spent my entire life sacrificing for his future. How could I suddenly resent him for chasing it? Still, understanding something does not make it hurt any less. Every Sunday morning, I continued baking apple pie. Old habits become part of your heartbeat. You don't abandon them simply because life changes. Around noon, I would glance through the kitchen window every few minutes. The gravel driveway remained empty. By 2 o'clock, the coffee had gone cold. By 3, the pie cooled on the counter untouched. By evening, I wrapped the leftovers and delivered them to Mrs. Henderson or the children across the street. When people thanked me, I smiled. I never told them that every slice had been baked for someone else. One afternoon, Daniel arrived unexpectedly with his little daughter, Emma. She was barely 3 years old. The moment she stepped into my house, she laughed at the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Its slow ticking fascinated her. She wandered into the kitchen and climbed onto the same wooden chair where her father used to sit. "Grandma, what are you making?" "Apple pie." She dipped one tiny finger into the bowl of cinnamon sugar and giggled. The sound filled every empty corner of the house. For a few wonderful hours, time seemed to turn backward. Daniel fixed a loose cabinet door. Emma chased butterflies in the backyard. I watched them from the porch, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. For the first time in months, the silence had disappeared. When evening came, Emma ran toward me with flowers still on her little cheeks. "Can I stay here forever?" Daniel laughed. "I think Mommy would miss you," Emma thought carefully. Then answered, "We can all live here." Children have a remarkable gift. They see family before they see status, love before appearances, home before luxury. As their car disappeared down the road, I stood waving until the taillights vanished. Then I walked back inside. Emma's tiny fingerprints still marked the kitchen table. A little flour remained scattered across the floor. I left it there until the next morning. Some messes are too beautiful to clean away too quickly. Weeks passed, then months. One Sunday I called Daniel instead. He answered immediately. "I'm so sorry, Mom. We were just leaving for brunch with Evelyn's parents." His voice was hurried. In the background I heard laughter, crystal glasses, soft piano music, someone calling his name. I looked at the apple pie cooling beside me. "It's all right, sweetheart, enjoy your day." After we hung up, I sat alone in the dining room. 3 plates had already been placed on the table. One for me, one for Daniel, one for Evelyn. Slowly, I picked up the 3rd plate and returned it to the cabinet, then the 2nd, leaving only one. The room suddenly felt much larger, much quieter. That evening, Mrs. Henderson stopped by with a basket of fresh tomatoes from her garden. She noticed the untouched pie. "You should freeze it," I shook my head. "It doesn't taste the same after freezing." She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Margaret, when was the last time you bought something just for yourself?" I searched my memory. A new coat, perhaps 10 years ago, a vacation. I couldn't remember ever taking one. A piece of jewelry? Not since my wedding ring. Finally, I smiled. "I suppose I've always been saving for someone else's tomorrow." Mrs. Henderson reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "And who saves for yours?" I didn't answer, because I already knew. For 40 years, my happiness had never depended on what I owned. It depended on hearing my son walk through the front door, and without realizing it, I had spent so many years building his future that I had forgotten to build a life for myself. Outside, the autumn wind carried the first falling leaves across the yard. One landed softly on the empty chair across from mine. For a brief second, I imagined Daniel sitting there again, smiling, hungry. Asking for another slice of pie, I smiled back at the memory, then quietly stood up, cleared the untouched plates, and folded the tablecloth for another Sunday that had slipped silently into the visible. No bruises, no raised voices, no cruel words. Just a quiet moment that slips into your heart and stays there forever. It was early December when Daniel called. "Mom, we're hosting our first Christmas dinner at the new house this year. You have to come." His excitement reminded me of the little boy who once begged me to watch every school play and every baseball game. I smiled before he even finished speaking. "Of course I'll be there." After we hung up, I stood in the middle of my kitchen for a long time. The old calendar on the wall still showed November. I walked over and turned the page. December, Christmas, family. Somehow, those words still carried the same magic they had when Daniel was a child. For the next 2 weeks, I prepared as though I were attending the most important day of my life. I opened the cedar chest in my bedroom and carefully took out my best dress. It was navy blue, simple. The same dress I had worn to Daniel's law school graduation. I spent an entire afternoon sewing a loose button back into place. Then I polished my shoes until I could almost see my reflection. The evening before Christmas, I baked an apple pie. Not because anyone had asked me to. Because every important memory in our family had always begun with the smell of apples and cinnamon. I wrapped it carefully in a white cloth embroidered with tiny flowers. The cloth had belonged to my mother. Some things deserve to be carried from one generation to the next. Love, recipes, forgiveness. I arrived at Daniel and Evelyn's home just before sunset. The house was breathtaking. Large stone columns framed the entrance. Garlands of pine and white lights wrapped around every railing. Inside, a magnificent Christmas tree reached almost to the ceiling. Crystal ornaments reflected thousands of tiny lights across polished marble floors. Guests filled every room: attorneys, business owners, judges, politicians, people whose names appeared in newspapers. For a moment, I stood quietly near the entrance, not because I felt unwelcome, because I suddenly felt very small. Daniel hurried over and kissed my cheek. "I'm so glad you came, Mom." His eyes looked tired. He had spent the entire evening greeting guests and managing conversations. I handed him the apple pie, for later. He smiled exactly the way he had when he was 10 years old. My favorite. Then someone called his name. He squeezed my hand. "I'll be right back." I watched him disappear into the crowd. He never made it back, not because he didn't care. Because too many people needed a piece of him at the same time. Across the room, Evelyn moved gracefully from guest to guest. She looked elegant, confident. Every detail of the evening reflected months of planning. When she finally noticed me, she walked over with a warm smile. "You look lovely, Margaret." "Thank you, dear." She glanced around the crowded dining room. Every seat at the main table was occupied by clients, investors, and family friends. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed her face. Then she spoke gently. "We set another table in the breakfast room. It's quieter there. I thought you might be more comfortable." Her voice was kind. She believed she was being considerate. She never imagined what those words would mean to me. I followed her without protest. The breakfast room was beautiful in its own way. Smaller, warmer, closer to the kitchen. A few household staff members were finishing their meals before returning to work. One elderly chauffeur smiled politely and pulled out a chair for me. I thanked him and sat down. Through the open doorway, I could see the grand dining hall. Laughter echoed beneath crystal chandeliers, glasses clinked together. Christmas music drifted softly through the house. And at the center of it all sat my son, successful, respected, admired. Exactly the future I had prayed for. I should have been happy. Instead, I found myself staring at the empty chair beside me. For just a moment, I imagined a little boy climbing onto it with scraped knees and messy hair. "Mom, can I have another piece of pie?" I blinked, the image disappeared. A young waitress approached carrying dessert. She placed a slice of my apple pie in front of me. It's delicious, she whispered. The chef said it's the best pie in the house. I smiled, thank you. But somehow it tasted different. Apple pie was never meant to be eaten alone. Halfway through dinner, Emma wandered into the breakfast room holding a stuffed rabbit. The moment she saw me, her face lit up. Grandma. She ran straight into my arms. Without hesitation, she climbed onto my lap and rested her head against my shoulder. I couldn't find you. I kissed her forehead. I'm right here. She looked around the quiet room. Why aren't you eating with Mommy and Daddy? Before I could answer, Evelyn entered. For the first time that evening, her smile faded. She looked at her daughter, then at me. Then through the doorway, toward the crowded dining hall. Something changed in her eyes, only for a second, a flicker of doubt, perhaps guilt. Perhaps the uncomfortable realization that children see truths adults spend years learning to ignore. She gently took Emma's hand. The guests are waiting, Emma frowned. I want Grandma to sit with us. Evelyn hesitated. Then softly replied, maybe next time. Those 3 words settled over the room like falling snow. Maybe next time. I had heard them before, next Sunday, next month, next holiday. Next year, life has a quiet way of hiding loss inside promises of tomorrow. When the evening finally ended, Daniel walked me to my car. I'm sorry I didn't get to spend more time with you. I reached up and straightened his collar the way I had done since he was a little boy. You were busy. He lowered his eyes. I'll make it up to you, I smiled. You don't have to make up for anything. But as I drove home through streets glowing with Christmas lights, the house felt colder than usual. I carried the empty pie dish into my kitchen, washed it carefully, dried it, placed it back on the highest shelf. Then I looked across the room. Only one chair stood beside the table. Without thinking, I walked over and gently touched the worn wooden backrest. For the first time in many years, I wondered whether waiting for someone to come home could slowly become another way of saying goodbye. There comes a moment in every mother's life when she realizes that love must learn to stand at a distance. Not because it has grown weaker, but because holding on too tightly may only become another burden for the child she loves. The morning after Christmas dinner, I woke before sunrise. The house was still. Outside, a thin layer of snow covered the little garden. The footprints I had made the night before were already disappearing beneath the wind. I stood at the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee and watched the first light touch the maple tree. For the first time in many years, I did not bake an apple pie. The apples remained in the wooden basket. The cinnamon jar stayed closed. The old mixing bowl never left its shelf. The silence in the kitchen felt unfamiliar, yet strangely peaceful. Perhaps because hope, when repeated too many times without answer, slowly learns how to become acceptance. That afternoon, I opened every window in the house. I packed away the extra dinner plates, folded the embroidered tablecloth my mother had sewn decades earlier. Then I carried the 3rd chair from the dining table into the spare bedroom upstairs. The room suddenly looked smaller. But my heart somehow felt lighter. Waiting is exhausting. Especially when the person you're waiting for has no idea you're still waiting. Days turned into weeks. I began walking every morning through the neighborhood park. People greeted me by name. Children waved. Dog walkers stopped to chat. For years, my entire world had revolved around Daniel. Now, little by little, I allowed myself to notice the rest of the world again. One Wednesday afternoon, the elementary school librarian asked if I would volunteer to read stories to the children. I accepted without hesitation. The library smelled of paper, crayons, and freshly sharpened pencils. Tiny chairs lined the reading corner. Every week, 20 bright little faces gathered around me as I read aloud. Pirates, princesses, talking bears, runaway rabbits. When I changed my voice for different characters, the children laughed so hard that tears rolled down their cheeks. Their laughter echoed through the room long after they left. For a few precious hours each week, My house no longer felt empty. One little boy named Noah always stayed behind after story time. His grandmother had passed away the year before. He would help me put books back on the shelves. One afternoon he looked up at me and asked, "Do grandmas ever get lonely?" I smiled. "Sometimes. What do they do?" "They find someone else to love." He thought carefully before nodding, then slipped his tiny hand into mine. "Then you can borrow me." I laughed, a real laugh. The kind I hadn't heard from myself in a very long time. When I returned home that evening, the quiet no longer frightened me. Perhaps loneliness changes shape when shared with kindness. Spring arrived early that year. The first roses bloomed beside the white fence. Every birthday Daniel had ever celebrated, I planted one new rose bush. It had become a tradition after his father died. One flower for another year of watching my son grow. Now there were dozens, red, white, pink, deep crimson. Each carried a small brass marker with a year engraved upon it. 1989, 1990, 1991, every bloom held a memory. The year he lost his first tooth. The year he won the spelling bee. The year he cried because another child was being bullied. The year he graduated. The year he married. I spent hours tending those roses, pruning branches, pulling weeds, watering roots. Some neighbors believed gardening was my hobby. It wasn't. It was the closest thing I had left to raising my son. Plants and children are surprisingly alike. Neither grows because you watch them every minute. They grow because someone cared for them faithfully long before anyone noticed. Daniel still called from time to time, never out of obligation, always with affection. "Hi, Mom, how are you doing?" "I'm wonderful." "What did you do today?" "Oh." I read stories to some children, worked in the garden, made soup. He sounded relieved. "I'm glad you're keeping busy." "I am." Neither of us mentioned the Sundays that had disappeared. Neither of us spoke about the empty chair. Neither of us admitted how much we missed the life we once shared. Love often hides inside ordinary conversations. Sometimes, "How are you?" really means, "Do you still need me?" Sometimes, "I'm fine" actually means, "I miss you more than words can say." One evening, after hanging up the phone, I walked into the attic searching for an old photo album. Instead, I found a worn cedar box tucked beneath a blanket. Inside lay my husband's watch, our wedding photograph, Daniel's first pair of baby shoes, and the little black notebook where I had recorded every dollar I spent while raising him. I brushed the dust from its cover. For a long moment, I simply held it. Page after page filled with tiny handwriting, school lunches, winter coats, medicine, books, tuition. Beside many entries were quiet notes only a mother would write. "Skipped dinner today. Daniel needed new boots. Patched my coat again. His field trip comes first. Sold my ring, he'll never know." I smiled through tears. Not because I regretted any of it, but because I had almost forgotten the woman I used to be. The woman who believed no sacrifice was too great if it meant her son could dream bigger dreams. Carefully, I closed the notebook and placed it back inside the cedar box. One day I thought, perhaps Daniel would find it. Not so he would feel guilty, not so he would repay me. Only so he would understand that everything beautiful in his life had been watered by quiet acts no one had ever seen. Outside, the evening breeze drifted through the open window. The rose bushes swayed gently beneath the fading light. Some petals fell softly onto the grass, not because they had died, but because every flower, no matter how beautiful, must eventually let go. Standing there, watching them fall, I realized something that changed me forever. Perhaps loving someone is not spending your whole life asking them to come back. Perhaps loving someone is making sure that if they ever do, they still know exactly where home is. There is something curious about memory. When life moves too quickly, the things that matter most quietly disappear into the background. Not because we stop loving them, but because we assume they will always be there. The little white house had stood at the end of Maple Street for almost 50 years, Its porch was weathered. The paint had faded. The wind chimes by the front door still played the same gentle melody every afternoon. Nothing about it had changed. Except the people who came to visit. One Saturday morning, nearly 2 months after Christmas, Daniel found himself driving toward my house. There was no special occasion, no holiday, no birthday. A meeting nearby had been canceled unexpectedly, leaving him with an empty afternoon. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he turned off the highway and followed the familiar country road instead. The closer he came, the slower he drove, every mailbox, every fence. Every maple tree carried pieces of his childhood. When he finally pulled into the driveway, he noticed something unusual. My old pickup truck was gone. Mrs. Henderson was kneeling beside her garden across the street. She looked up and smiled. "Your mother volunteers at the elementary school on Saturdays now. She'll be back later." Daniel nodded. "I'll wait." He unlocked the front door with the spare key I had insisted he keep years ago. The house greeted him with the same quiet warmth it always had. The scent of cedar wood lingered in the hallway. The grandfather clock still marked every passing second with patient certainty. Nothing inside suggested loneliness, everything suggested care. The curtains were freshly washed, the wooden floor gleamed. Fresh flowers stood in a glass jar by the kitchen sink. His eyes wandered toward the backyard. He stepped outside and stopped. The rose garden had grown larger than he remembered. Bush after bush stretched across the fence line. Red roses, white roses, soft pink roses, each one perfectly tended. At the base of every bush stood a small brass plaque, 1989, 1990, 1991, 1992. Daniel walked slowly between them. His fingers brushed the engraved numbers, until suddenly he understood. 1 rose for every year of his life. His throat tightened. He counted them. There were 38 birthdays. 38 years, his mother had planted something beautiful simply because he existed. The wind carried the scent of roses through the afternoon air. For a long moment, he stood perfectly still. He could remember receiving expensive gifts from clients, awards from judges, recognition from newspapers, yet somehow, no gesture had ever felt as valuable as a garden quietly blooming year after year, without asking for anything in return. Back inside the house, Daniel wandered upstairs. His childhood bedroom remained almost untouched. Baseball trophies gathered dust on the shelf. An old photograph of father and son still rested beside the bed. Inside the closet hung the blue winter coat his mother had saved months to buy. He smiled, then frowned. The sleeves looked shorter than he remembered. Because his mother had secretly let out the seams twice as he grew taller, he had never noticed. Children rarely do. In the attic, sunlight slipped through a narrow window onto a cedar chest. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside lay his father's watch, an old wedding photograph, tiny baby shoes, and beneath them, a black notebook with worn corners. He hesitated before opening it. The first page contained nothing more than numbers: rent, groceries, electric bill, school supplies. But as he turned the pages, the handwriting changed. Beside every expense appeared small notes written only for the woman who had lived those days. Didn't buy myself a winter coat. Daniel needs boots. Worked another evening shift. His science books cost more this semester. Sold my wedding ring today. He'll never know, and that's all right. Daniel stopped reading, his vision blurred. He remembered asking his mother where her ring had gone. She had smiled. "I lost it while planting flowers." He had believed her. He remembered complaining because the other children had newer backpacks. 2 weeks later, a brand new backpack appeared beside his bed. He never wondered what she had gone without to buy it. Another page. "Skipped dinner tonight. Daniel ate well, that's enough." Another. "My fever is worse. I'll see a doctor after tuition is paid." Another. "Today he told me he'll take care of me one day. He doesn't owe me anything." Seeing him smile is already more than enough. Daniel sat down on the attic floor. The notebook trembled in his hands. Every promotion, every courtroom victory. every expensive suit hanging in his closet, had been stitched together by sacrifices invisible to him. The silence around him became unbearable. He lowered his head and wept, not quietly, not politely, but with the deep, helpless grief of a son, finally seeing what his mother had hidden all his life. Outside, the wind moved gently through the rose garden. Petals drifted across the grass like fragments of forgotten years. Late that afternoon, I returned home carrying a stack of children's books against my chest. Before opening the gate, I noticed a familiar black sedan parked beneath the maple tree. For one brief second, my heart beat exactly as it had decades ago when a little boy used to run home from school. I stepped onto the porch. The front door stood slightly open. Inside, I found Daniel sitting alone at the kitchen table. The old notebook rested before him, his shoulders shook silently. He looked older than he had only that morning, not because of time, but because truth has a way of changing a person in a single afternoon. He slowly stood as I entered. Our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. Some discoveries are too sacred for immediate words. In the fading light, with the scent of roses drifting through the open window and the worn notebook lying between us, I realized something unexpected. A mother's sacrifices are not forgotten because they are small. They are forgotten because she spends her entire life making them look effortless, and perhaps the greatest heartbreak is not that our children never knew. It is that we loved them enough to make sure they never had to. Regret rarely arrives with noise, it comes quietly. Like dust settling on an unopened gift. Like finding a photograph years after the moment has passed. Like realizing someone loved you long before you ever learned how to appreciate them. The afternoon Daniel returned from my house, he said very little. He walked through the front door, carrying the old black notebook against his chest, as though it were something fragile. He didn't loosen his tie. He didn't answer his phone, he didn't even turn on the lights. He simply sat at the dining table and stared at its worn cover. Evelyn watched him from the kitchen. In all the years they had been married, she had never seen him like this. Not after losing a difficult case. Not after the death of a respected colleague. Not even after the endless nights that had nearly exhausted him. There was something different in his silence. Something deeper than sadness. It looked like grief. She approached slowly. Daniel, he looked up, his eyes were red. Without saying a word, he slid the notebook across the table. I found this at Mom's house. Evelyn opened it carefully. At first she saw only numbers, groceries, rent, school fees, medicine. Then she noticed the notes written in the margins, tiny sentences, almost invisible. Yet heavy enough to change a person's heart. Didn't buy myself new shoes. Daniel's feet are growing again. Worked through the flu today. He needs money for his school trip. Fixed my old coat. He deserves a warm winter. The room became perfectly still. Page after page revealed a life Evelyn had never imagined. She had known Margaret as a quiet woman who baked apple pies and smiled gently. She had never known the young widow who skipped meals so her son could eat. The exhausted mother who worked until midnight. The woman who sold her wedding ring without telling anyone. Evelyn turned another page. A single dried rose petal slipped onto the table. Beside it Margaret had written, Daniel smiled today. That is enough to make this a good year. Evelyn pressed her hand against her mouth. For a long moment, she could not breathe. She remembered the first Christmas after her marriage. Margaret had arrived carrying a warm apple pie wrapped in embroidered cloth. Evelyn had thanked her politely before handing it to the kitchen staff to serve later. She had been busy arranging the evening, greeting important guests, managing every detail. She never noticed the quiet disappointment hidden behind Margaret's smile. Not because Margaret blamed her. Because Margaret was too kind to let anyone see her pain. Another memory returned, the breakfast room. Emma climbing into her grandmother's lap, the innocent question. Why isn't Grandma sitting with us? At the time, Evelyn had answered, maybe next time. Now those words echoed painfully inside her mind. maybe next time. How many families slowly fall apart because of those 3 words? Next week, next month, next year, until one day, there is no next time left. Late that night, unable to sleep, Evelyn walked into the guest room. She opened an old cedar chest where forgotten gifts had been stored after every holiday. Scarves, cookbooks, handmade ornaments, then she found it. The knitted blue scarf Margaret had given her during their first winter together. It was still wrapped in tissue paper, never worn, never unfolded. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it out. The yarn was soft, every stitch perfectly even. Someone had spent dozens of quiet evenings making it by hand. She imagined Margaret sitting alone beneath a small reading lamp, knitting carefully. Stopping every so often to smile, thinking about her daughter-in-law wearing it one day. Tears rolled silently down Evelyn's cheeks. For years she had believed love was measured by expensive gifts, elegant parties, beautiful houses, successful appearances. Yet the greatest act of love she had ever received had been waiting untouched inside a box. She wrapped the scarf around her shoulders. It carried the faint scent of cedar and lavender. For reasons she could not explain, it felt like being gently embraced. The next morning, Emma wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She looked at the blue scarf and smiled. Grandma made that. Evelyn nodded. Yes. Emma climbed onto a chair. Can we visit Grandma today? Evelyn looked toward the window. Sunlight spilled across the breakfast table. For the first time since marrying Daniel, she realized how quiet their beautiful house truly was. It had marble floors, crystal chandeliers, designer furniture. But it did not hold the warmth of Margaret's little kitchen, where cinnamon drifted through the air and laughter lingered long after dessert. Children understand home instinctively. Adults often spend a lifetime trying to find it again. That afternoon, while Daniel worked in his office without speaking, Evelyn drove alone to the elementary school where Margaret volunteered. She parked across the street. Through the library window, she saw an elderly woman sitting in a tiny wooden chair surrounded by children. Margaret was reading aloud, changing her voice for every character. The children laughed until they leaned against one another. One little boy rested his head against her shoulder, another held her hand. When story time ended, every child lined up to hug her goodbye. Margaret smiled at each one as though they belonged to her. Evelyn remained inside the car, unable to move. She suddenly understood something she had never seen before. A woman who spends her entire life giving love does not stop simply because her own family grows distant. She keeps giving it to whoever needs it, to strangers, to neighbors, to lonely children, to the world. Because loving is no longer something she does, it has become who she is. Evelyn lowered her head onto the steering wheel and wept. Not because Margaret had ever judged her, but because Margaret never had. Grace can be far more painful than anger. As she wiped away her tears, she made a silent promise. She could not change the past. She could not erase the empty chair at Christmas. She could not take back the countless moments she had overlooked, but perhaps, if God was merciful, she could still become the daughter Margaret had quietly loved from the very beginning. And somewhere across town, in the little white house beneath the old maple tree, an apple pie cooled on the kitchen counter, waiting. As it always had, for someone to come home. There are moments in life when the past stops being a memory, it becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, we finally see not only who loved us, but who we have become. For 3 nights after finding the notebook, Daniel barely slept. The leather chair in his office remained untouched. Important contracts piled up on his desk. His phone vibrated endlessly with calls from clients. He ignored every one of them. Instead, he sat alone in the quiet, the old black notebook resting in front of him. He had read every page, then read them again. And somehow, each reading revealed another sacrifice he had never noticed. He remembered being 8 years old and begging for a bicycle. Most of his classmates already had one. He wanted to ride with them after school. A month later, on Christmas morning, a bright red bicycle stood beside the fireplace. He had screamed with joy and thrown his arms around his mother. He never asked where the money had come from, now he knew. Tucked inside the notebook was a faded receipt. Below it, Margaret had written in careful handwriting, "Sold the television today." Daniel's smile will fill the house better than any program ever could. Daniel closed his eyes, the old television. He remembered coming home one afternoon and asking why it was gone. His mother had smiled. It finally stopped working. She had lied. Not to protect herself, but to protect his happiness. Another memory surfaced. He was 12. The winter had been especially cold. His classmates teased him because his coat was old. The next week, his mother surprised him with a brand new one. He wore it proudly every day. Only now did he remember something he had never questioned, that same winter. His mother wore the same thin gray coat she'd owned for years. Its sleeves had been patched. The collar was frayed. She always insisted she wasn't cold. Children believe what love tells them. Adults eventually learn to recognize what love hides. Daniel stood and walked slowly into the hallway. Emma's laughter drifted upstairs. She was building a blanket fort with Evelyn. He watched them from a distance. His daughter looked up and smiled. "Daddy, come play." For a brief second, time folded in on itself. He saw another little child, himself, holding wooden blocks in the living room, while Margaret pretended every crooked tower was a castle. She never rushed him. Never complained that she was tired. Even after working late into the night, she always found enough strength to kneel beside him and build one more tower. He suddenly understood something that had haunted him ever since reading the notebook. His mother had not sacrificed parts of her life. She had quietly offered him the whole of it. Later that evening, Daniel drove alone through the old neighborhood. The streets looked smaller than he remembered. The grocery store where Margaret once worked still stood at the corner. The windows had changed, the sign had faded. But the automatic doors opened with the same familiar sound. Inside, an elderly cashier recognized him immediately. "Daniel Collins?" He smiled politely. "It's been a long time," she nodded. "I used to work with your mother." He swallowed hard. "What was she like?" The woman laughed softly, always smiling. Then her expression changed. One winter, the heating system broke in the store. Everyone complained about the cold. Your mother took off her own sweater and wrapped it around a new employee who couldn't stop shivering. She worked the rest of the shift in a thin uniform. Daniel stared at her. "That sounds like her." The cashier tilted her head. "No, it sounds like a mother." As he walked back toward his car, snow began to fall. Tiny white flakes settled across the windshield. He remembered another snowy evening decades earlier. His mother carrying him home after he had fallen asleep at a Christmas parade. He had been too heavy. She had stumbled twice. But she never put him down. Only now did he wonder how exhausted she must have been. Love had hidden the weight from him. The next morning, Daniel visited the little cemetery where his father rested. He hadn't been there in years. The headstone was simple, the grass carefully trimmed. Someone had placed fresh flowers there. His mother, even now, even after 40 years, she still came. He knelt before the stone. For a long time, he said nothing. Finally, he whispered, "I kept my promise to become successful. But somewhere along the way, I forgot the promise that mattered most." The wind carried dried leaves across the path. In the silence, he imagined what his father might have said. "Take care of her. She carried both of us." Driving home, Daniel noticed something he had passed hundreds of times without seeing. An elderly woman stood outside a small bakery, holding the hand of her grown son. They laughed together over something insignificant. The son brushed snow from his mother's shoulders before helping her into the car. It was such an ordinary gesture, so small, so effortless. Yet Daniel felt his chest tighten. Success had taught him how to negotiate million-dollar contracts, how to persuade judges, how to win impossible cases. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten how precious an ordinary afternoon with his mother could be. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Daniel found Evelyn sitting quietly in the living room. The blue knitted scarf Margaret had made rested around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke at first. Words seemed too small for what they carried inside. Finally, Daniel sat beside her. "I've spent years trying to give Mom a better life." Evelyn reached for his hand. "You did." He shook his head slowly. "I gave her comfort. But I stopped giving her my time." The room fell silent again. Outside, snow drifted gently beneath the porch light. Inside, two people sat surrounded by a beautiful home that suddenly felt incomplete. Daniel looked toward the window. Somewhere beyond the city lights stood a little white house beneath an old maple tree. A kitchen that still smelled of apples and cinnamon. A woman who had spent her life waiting without complaint. He closed the notebook one final time, then looked at Evelyn. His voice was quiet but certain. "We're going to see Mom." Evelyn nodded before he finished the sentence. "No phone call, no announcement, no excuses. We're going home." For the first time in many years, Daniel understood that the longest journey he would ever make was not across states or courtrooms. It was the short road back to the front porch, where his mother had never stopped believing he would return. And before the first light of morning touched the city skyline, their bags were already packed beside the front door. Some journeys begin with a map, others begin with regret. The morning they left the city, the sky was still wrapped in darkness. The streets that usually overflowed with traffic were strangely empty. Daniel carried a small overnight bag to the car. Evelyn buckled Emma into the back seat. For a moment, none of them spoke. The engine started softly. Headlights stretched across the quiet road. And without another word, they began driving toward the place where everything had once begun. Emma leaned forward between the front seats. "Are we going to Grandma's house?" Daniel smiled through tired eyes. "Yes, sweetheart." Emma clapped her hands. "I've missed her." Children have a way of saying simple truths that adults spend years trying to avoid. As the city disappeared behind them, tall buildings gave way to open fields. Billboards became wooden fences. Concrete turned into winding country roads, lined with maple trees. Every mile carried Daniel deeper into memories he had buried beneath meetings and deadlines. "There used to be an old ice cream stand over there," he said quietly. "I fell off my bicycle, once trying to race another boy." Evelyn glanced out the window. "And your mother?" "She ran all the way from home. She carried me nearly half a mile because I refused to stop crying." He laughed softly, then his laughter faded. "I don't think I ever thanked her." The silence that followed was gentle, no longer uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people finally learning how to remember. Hours later, they reached Maple Street. Nothing seemed to have changed. The old church still stood at the corner. The barber shop still displayed its faded striped pole. Mrs. Henderson's blue shutters were still crooked. Time had touched everything, but somehow left the soul of the town untouched. Daniel slowed the car as they approached the little white house, then stopped. The curtains were open. The flower boxes beneath the windows overflowed with color. The porch swing moved gently in the breeze, but the driveway was empty. A feeling he could not explain settled over him. He stepped out quickly. The front porch creaked beneath his feet exactly as it had when he was 10 years old. He knocked once, twice. No answer. The door remained closed. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson emerged carrying a basket of fresh vegetables. The moment she saw Daniel, she smiled sadly. "I wondered when you'd come." His heart tightened. "Where's Mom?" Mrs. Henderson walked slowly toward him. "She moved a few weeks ago." Daniel felt the world pause. "Moved, just outside town. A little cottage by Willow Lake." He stared at her. "But why?" The elderly woman looked toward the rose garden blooming beside the fence. She said the house had become too quiet. Her voice softened. She wanted to wake up somewhere she could hear birds instead of memories. Emma tugged gently at Daniel's sleeve. "Can we go find Grandma now?" Mrs. Henderson smiled at the little girl, then reached into her apron pocket. "I almost forgot." She handed Daniel a cream-colored envelope. His name was written across the front in Margaret's familiar handwriting. The letters were careful, steady. Exactly as they had always been. He hesitated before opening it. Inside was only a single page. No bitterness, no accusations, no sorrow. Just a mother's quiet heart poured into words. My dear Daniel, if you're reading this, then life has finally given you enough time to slow down. Don't worry about me. I've spent my whole life building a home for you. Now I'm learning how to build a quiet little life for myself. Please don't carry guilt. The greatest gift a child can give a parent is not success. It is kindness. Love your wife. Be patient with your daughter. Sit down for dinner even when you're busy. Call the people you love before tomorrow becomes next year. And every once in a while, bake an apple pie. Because families are held together by ordinary moments that seem unimportant until they are gone. Love always, Mom. By the time Daniel reached the bottom of the page, tears blurred the words. The letter slipped slightly in his hands. He lowered his head. All those years he had imagined his mother waiting for him with disappointment. Instead, she had been praying for his happiness, even in her loneliness, even in her silence. She had protected him from guilt just as fiercely as she had once protected him from hunger. Evelyn stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. When she reached the final line, she quietly slipped her arm through his. Neither of them spoke. Some apologies cannot be prepared, they can only be lived. Mrs. Henderson pointed toward the hills beyond town. The cottage is about 20 minutes from here, right by the lake. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket, over his heart, the place where it belonged. As they drove away, Emma looked back through the rear window. Grandma forgot her roses. Mrs. Henderson, still standing by the fence, whispered to herself, "No, sweetheart." She planted them so someone else would remember. The road narrowed as they left town. Tall pines lined both sides. Sunlight filtered through the branches, painting shifting patterns across the windshield. The farther they drove, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no ringing phones, no schedules. Only the sound of tires rolling over gravel and the distant songs of birds hidden among the trees. Then, as they rounded the final bend, Willow Lake appeared. Its surface shimmered beneath the afternoon sun like polished glass. On the far shore stood a small white cottage with blue shutters. Smoke drifted gently from the chimney. A rocking chair rested on the porch. Laundry danced softly on a clothesline nearby. And in the garden beside the house, an elderly woman wearing a faded blue apron knelt among rows of blooming flowers, carefully brushing soil from her hands. Daniel's foot froze above the brake pedal, his breathing caught. For one endless moment, the successful attorney, respected by judges and admired by colleagues, disappeared completely. In his place was only a little boy again. A boy who had once believed his mother could fix anything, and who now prayed with all his heart that it was not too late for her to heal the one thing he had broken without ever meaning to. The car rolled quietly to a stop beneath the shade of an old willow tree. No one moved, no one spoke. Across the garden, Margaret slowly lifted her head, as if some invisible thread had gently tugged at her heart, and at that very instant, their eyes met. There are reunions that begin with words. And there are reunions that begin with tears. This was the second kind. For a long moment, no one moved. The afternoon breeze drifted across Willow Lake, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth through the little garden. Margaret remained kneeling beside a bed of white daisies, her gardening gloves still covered with soil. Across the yard, Daniel stood frozen beside the car. The years between them seemed to disappear all at once. No successful attorney, no aging widow, no misunderstandings, only a mother. And the little boy she had spent a lifetime loving, Emma was the first to run, Grandma. Her small voice broke the silence like sunlight breaking through clouds. Margaret looked up, then smiled. The kind of smile that only appears when joy arrives unexpectedly. She opened her arms. Emma rushed into them without hesitation. I missed you. Margaret kissed the top of her granddaughter's head. I missed you too, sweetheart. Behind them, Daniel finally took a step forward, then another. Each step felt strangely difficult, as though regret had weight. He stopped only a few feet away, his lips parted, but no words came. How could they? How could a lifetime of gratitude, guilt, love, and sorrow ever fit inside a single apology? Margaret stood slowly. She removed her gloves, brushed the soil from her apron, then looked at her son, the little boy who had once hidden behind her skirt on the first day of school. The young man she had watched become everything she had prayed he would be. The father now standing before her with tears in his eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his cheek. Just as she had done when he was small. My sweet boy, that was all, no accusations, no questions. No mention of missed Sundays or empty chairs. Only the same words she had spoken thousands of times throughout his childhood. Daniel could no longer hold himself together. He fell into her arms. I am sorry, Mom. The words came broken, barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry. Margaret held him the way she had held him after scraped knees, failed exams, and childhood fears. Steady, patient, certain. She rested her hand gently on the back of his head. You're home, nothing more. Because mothers understand something the world often forgets. Sometimes forgiveness is not a decision. It is simply another name for love. Evelyn stood a few steps away, unable to hide her tears. For months she had rehearsed what she would say. She had imagined long explanations, carefully chosen apologies. Now none of them seemed necessary. She walked forward slowly. Before she could speak, Margaret embraced her too. The younger woman trembled. I should have seen you. Margaret smiled softly. You do now. I made you feel alone. We all become busy sometimes. I thought appearances mattered. Margaret looked toward the quiet lake. When people reach my age, they stop remembering who sat at the head of the table. They remember who sat beside them. Evelyn lowered her head. The knitted blue scarf rested around her shoulders. Margaret noticed it immediately. You wore it. Evelyn nodded through tears. I should have worn it years ago. Margaret reached out and straightened the edge of the scarf. It kept waiting, just like I did. No bitterness, only grace, and somehow. Grace hurt more than blame ever could. The afternoon slipped quietly into evening. No one hurried to leave. Daniel helped repair the old fence near the garden. Emma chased butterflies along the lakeshore. Evelyn joined Margaret in the kitchen. The cottage was small, nothing matched, the cabinets were worn. The table carried years of scratches. The curtains fluttered in the open windows. Yet every corner held a warmth no mansion could imitate. Margaret placed a bowl of sliced apples on the counter. Cinnamon is in the second cabinet. Evelyn found it, the flour, top shelf, the butter, in the little blue dish. Soon the kitchen filled with familiar sounds. The soft rhythm of rolling dough. The clinking of measuring spoons. The quiet laughter of two women, no longer separated by pride. Margaret guided Evelyn gently. Don't press too hard, pie crust needs patience. Evelyn smiled, like families. Margaret looked at her with kind eyes, exactly like families. When the pie finally emerged from the oven, its golden crust filled the cottage with the scent that had followed Margaret through every chapter of her life. Apples, butter, cinnamon, home. They carried it outside and placed it on the old wooden table beneath a willow tree. Daniel looked around. The lake shimmered in the fading light. Emma sat swinging her legs from the bench, already reaching for a slice. Birdsong echoed across the water. For the first time in years, there were no ringing phones, no schedules. No important meetings waiting. Only 4 people sharing an ordinary meal. Daniel cut the first slice, then paused. He placed it gently onto Margaret's plate before serving anyone else. She looked at him in surprise. He smiled. When I was little, you always made sure I ate first. His voice caught. I think it's your turn now. Margaret looked down at the warm pie, then back at her son. No award he had ever won. No title he had ever earned. No success he had ever achieved could have meant more to her than that quiet gesture. The sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. Golden light reflected across Willow Lake. The four of them remained at the table long after the pie was gone, talking, laughing, remembering. The empty chair that had once haunted every holiday no longer existed. Not because it had been filled, but because everyone had finally learned that love should never be postponed until a more convenient tomorrow. As darkness settled gently over the cottage, Margaret looked at the faces around her. Then silently thanked life for one final miracle. Some families break and never find each other again, but some, if love has been patient enough, discover that the road home was waiting for them all along. And somewhere in the quiet garden, the evening breeze stirred the roses. Their petals drifted softly across the grass, not as symbols of endings, but as proof that every season of sacrifice can bloom again when watered by forgiveness. People often believe that miracles happen in an instant. A door opens, a prayer is answered, a life changes overnight. But the greatest miracles happen quietly. One ordinary day after another. One forgiven mistake after another. One family dinner at a time. A year passed. The seasons circled gently around Willow Lake. Spring covered the hills with wildflowers. Summer filled the air with the laughter of children chasing dragonflies. Autumn painted the maple trees in shades of gold and crimson. And when winter returned, the little white cottage glowed warmly beneath a blanket of snow. Margaret no longer counted the holidays she spent alone. Because she no longer spent them alone. Every Sunday morning, just after sunrise, a familiar black SUV appeared at the end of the gravel road. Emma was always the first to jump out. She never waited for the car door to close. She ran across the yard with the same excitement her father once had decades before. Grandma. Margaret would open the front door before Emma even reached the porch. As if she had been expecting her all along, perhaps she had. Some hearts never stop waiting. Inside the cottage, new traditions quietly took root. Daniel no longer checked his phone during lunch. If it rang, he turned it over. The world could wait, his family could not. Evelyn tied on a faded blue apron that Margaret had sewn by hand. At first she struggled to roll pie dough evenly. The crust tore, the apples spilled. Too much flour dusted the table. Margaret simply laughed. No one remembers a perfect pie. They remember who made it with them. Over time, Evelyn's hands learned the rhythm. Cold butter, warm apples, a pinch of cinnamon, patience, love. Emma insisted on cutting little stars from leftover dough and placing them across the top. Every pie looked slightly different. Every pie tasted like home. One snowy afternoon, while waiting for the oven timer to ring, Emma climbed into Margaret's lap with a school notebook. Grandma. My teacher asked us to write about a hero. Margaret smiled. Who did you choose? Emma answered without hesitation. You. Margaret laughed softly. Oh, sweetheart. I'm just an old woman who bakes pies. Emma shook her head. No. Mom says you built our family. The room grew quiet. Evelyn stopped kneading dough. Daniel lowered the stack of firewood he had been carrying. Neither of them spoke. Because they both knew the child had told the truth. Brick by brick, meal by meal, sacrifice by sacrifice. Margaret had built something stronger than any house. She had built a place where love could always find its way back. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked outside with his mother. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The lake shimmered beneath a pale winter sky. Near the fence stood a small patch of freshly turned earth. Daniel carried a young rose bush in his hands. I brought something. Margaret looked at the tiny plant. A rose, he nodded, for this year. Together they knelt in the cold soil. Daniel dug the hole himself. Then carefully lowered the roots into the earth. Margaret brushed loose dirt gently around the stem. For years she had planted one rose for every birthday her son celebrated. This time, her son planted one for her. He pressed the final handful of earth into place and quietly attached a small brass plaque. Not a year, not a date, only 4 simple words. For the heart of home, Margaret touched the plaque with trembling fingers. Tears filled her eyes, not tears of sorrow, but the quiet tears that arrive when life gives back something you had already accepted as lost. As evening settled over the lake, warm light spilled from the cottage windows. The apple pie cooled on the table. Fresh coffee filled the room with its rich aroma. Emma arranged 4 plates, then paused. She disappeared into the hallway. A moment later, she returned, carrying another wooden chair from the corner. She placed it carefully beside the table. Daniel smiled. "Who's that chair for?" Emma looked around at everyone, then answered with the simple wisdom only children possess. "So no one ever has to sit alone again." No one spoke. Margaret reached for Emma's little hand. Daniel reached for his mother's. Evelyn covered them both with her own. 4 hands, 3 generations, 1 family. Outside, snowflakes drifted silently through the night. Inside, the little cottage glowed with warmth. There were no crystal chandeliers, no marble floors, no distinguished guests, only worn wooden chairs. A faded blue apron hanging beside the stove. The scent of apples and cinnamon floating through the air. And the quiet certainty that love, when protected with patience, can survive even the longest seasons of distance. Before dessert, Daniel stood and lifted his coffee cup. His voice was steady. "When I was young, I believed success meant building the biggest house I could afford." He looked toward his mother. "Now, I know success is having a place where someone is always happy to see you come through the door." Margaret smiled. The same gentle smile that had carried her through 40 years of sacrifice. She looked around the table, at her son. At the daughter-in-law who now called her every Wednesday just to ask for advice. At her granddaughter covered in flour and laughter. Then she spoke the final words she would ever need to say. "A house can be built with money, but a family is built with ordinary moments that people choose not to miss." The room fell silent. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved gently through the willow branches. Far beyond the cottage, life continued its endless rush. Meetings would return, deadlines would return. The busy world would keep asking for more. But inside that little home by the lake, one lesson had finally taken root. Time is the one gift that cannot be earned back. And the people waiting for us today may become the memories we wish we had held on to tomorrow. So if someone you love is still only a phone call away, make the call. If a chair at your table is still empty, invite them. If your mother is still waiting for you, don't promise next time, go today. Because success may build a house, but only sacrifice, forgiveness, and love can build a family. And sometimes, all it takes to bring a family home again is the smell of an apple pie cooling on the windowsill.